Regional Planning Team, DRCOG. We're going to go ahead and get started. Some folks will be trickling in, but we've got some time before our panelist presentation and question and answer session. So I'll go ahead and get going. Next slide, please, Steph. All right, welcome everybody. So I'd like to first start by talking about MetroVision idea exchanges and sort of why they exist, what we hope to garner from them. So they really exist to advance regional learning. They're an opportunity to share experiences, ask questions, and explore ideas that help us all advance towards our community's goals. It's an opportunity to strengthen regional capacity together, creating space to share these experiences, grow a collaborative community of practice, supporting peer-to-peer learning and cross-jurisdictional problem solving, and then elevating successes and challenges across the region. So looking at emerging trends, innovation, and exploring opportunities for collective action where that arises. Next slide, please. All of this is rooted in MetroVision, and MetroVision is a plan adopted unanimously by our member governments. It protects and enhances the region's quality of life and is aspirational in nature, long range, and regional in focus. It offers ideas for local implementation, respects local plans while encouraging communities to work together. And next slide, please. And if we were to reduce the plan to one vision statement, it would be this one. Focused on a diverse network of vibrant, connected, lifelong communities that are served by a spectrum of housing, transportation, and employment while being respectful to our environment. Next slide, please. So I'll go over a quick agenda. So I highlighted what idea exchanges are, why we're doing them, what we're hoping to cover here. This idea exchange is going to center around parking policy in the region. We've done an idea exchange previously that looked at this topic, and we want to build off of that discussion and talk about some of the trends that we've seen in the region as a result of changing policy. We'll get to hear from staff from Boulder, Broomfield, Denver, and Longmont. And then following that, we'll have a question and answer session. And I do want to note, this presentation is being recorded. However, the Q&A session will not be recorded. We want everyone to feel comfortable asking questions and speaking freely. And with that, we look forward to a great discussion. Next slide, please. So to start, I want to talk about the regional angle and how parking policy connects to some of the themes in MetroVision. So that first theme is place. MetroVision calls for a coordinated regional development pattern with compact growth in centers and corridors. Parking policy is one of the land use tools that can reinforce this pattern, especially so when used with other tools like zoning and mixed-use development and multimodal infrastructure. And when communities update or right-size their parking requirements, it can free up land for more housing and employment within growth areas, and that is consistent with MetroVision's emphasis on efficient and connected development patterns. Next slide, please. We'll also get to hear from Jacob Rieger, our Transportation Division Director here at DRCOG. He'll speak a lot more to the mobility context. However, the mobility is a theme in the plan, and we wanted to touch on that here as well. MetroVision emphasizes a multimodal regional system, and parking policy intersects with this goal through its influence on urban form and access. Parking policy, again, can work in combination with other tools like mixed-use development, reliable transit, and walkable connections, which can help to shift travel behavior. And by right-sizing parking in areas with strong multimodal investments, communities can create conditions where multiple travel modes work effectively together, aligning with MetroVision's goals. Next slide, please. And then the last theme that we felt parking policy really strongly connected to was livability. And MetroVision calls for diverse housing options and communities that support health and inclusion. And parking requirements can inadvertently limit housing supply or increase development costs. And right-sizing them can open opportunities for more housing types and more attainable housing. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Jacob Rieger, Transportation Planning and Operations Division Director here at DRCOG. Jacob, take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Max. Really pleased to be here as part of this very important MetroVision idea exchange. Want to talk a little bit about the transportation aspect of it, along with our MetroVision plan that Max just talked about. One of our other foundational plans and really processes at DRCOG is our regional transportation plan, specifically our 2050 MetroVision regional transportation plan. We prepare this plan every 4 years under federal requirements. We're actually updating it now. And we do that as the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the region, which is a federal designation that basically says that we work, frankly, with all of you and all of our other stakeholders cooperatively to really set that vision for a multimodal transportation system. And that's what the plan does. What do we want for multimodal transportation in this region? And the plan sets that vision and guides investments in those projects, programs, services, and other components that will help the region realize that vision and help ultimately also implement the transportation theme of MetroVision that Max spoke to. Next slide, please. So really wanted to talk just for a moment about a really specific example from a regional perspective about parking policy and why it matters from that context. As part of our regional transportation plan work, one of the things that the plan addresses is a state requirement called the Greenhouse Gas Transportation Planning Standard, which was adopted back in late 2021 by the Colorado Transportation Commission. This greenhouse gas transportation standard applies to CDOT, the Colorado Department of Transportation, in the rural areas of the state, and it applies to the metropolitan planning organizations, of which there are 5, including DRCOG, in the more urban areas of the state. And the way we demonstrate compliance actually is through our regional transportation plan. Through that plan and our planning process, we need to meet the rules emission reduction levels, which are quantifiable, actual numerical targets for greenhouse gas reductions for different analysis periods between now and 2050. So as part of our multi-part strategy to demonstrate compliance with those reduction levels over the time frame between now and 2050, one of the things that we did was we developed a mitigation action plan which describes how those reductions in greenhouse gases would be met, in part at the regional level, and includes mitigation measures that would be implemented by partners in the region. And that's really important. There are a lot of strategies that we as DRCOG and the MPO are undertaking, but really it's our collective effort, our cumulative effort as a region that helps us reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the mitigation action plan in particular focuses on those strategies that are kind of beyond what DRCOG does or beyond kind of the projects or investments in the plan to really focus on what's being done at the local level and really ultimately meant to build on the good work that we're already doing in this region around several topics, but including, next slide, please, parking policy, because one of those key measures in the mitigation action plan is actually specifically reducing or eliminating minimum parking requirements. That is a specific measure that's detailed in the mitigation action plan that together with other measures and other parts of our compliance framework really helps the region meet greenhouse gas emission reduction periods for each of those analysis periods that are required of us. So parking policy is important in the big picture, but it's actually important in the very specific in terms of how it helps this region move forward. So with that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Noreen Smith, to introduce our panelists today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Now we'll transition to our main presenters. For attendees, please enter your questions for the presenters into the chat as we go, and we'll be answering questions at the end after all speakers present. Modern parking requirements is a timely topic as communities and our state legislators have recognized that the parking standards set in the past have largely been a disservice to our cities. As planners, we aim to create lively communities, but historically, parking standards have instead been a cause of sprawl, a contributor to housing unaffordability, a detriment to the environment, and a generally undesirable land use. Policymakers across the region are actively interested in updating their parking requirements, and today's panelists, Ben from Longmont, Libby from Denver, Mark from Broomfield, and Chris from Boulder, will help us demystify approaches to parking policy updates. As mentioned, DRCOG has an interest in parking in the region because of our transportation demand management work, our greenhouse gas mitigation work, our housing planning work, which are all referenced in MetroVision, along with our interest in assisting our member communities in their planning efforts. Our first panelist will be Ben Ortiz, who is a transportation planner with the City of Longmont. Before Longmont, Ben was a transportation planner for DRCOG, focusing on multimodal planning, TDM, and specialized transportation services. Prior to that, Ben worked on bicycle parking policy for the Los Angeles DOT and an incentive-based ride-sharing program for the LA County Metropolitan Transportation Authority. As a student at UCLA, he was exposed to the impacts of parking policy on urban form and transportation mode choice, and consequently has been thinking about parking reform ever since. I will turn it over to Ben now.
Thank you, Noreen. Yeah, I'm really happy to have the opportunity to present here. Let's see. So not too many people heard about Longmont eliminating its minimum parking requirements until we did it fully last year. And so what a lot of people don't realize, though, is that Longmont got rid of its minimum parking requirements and enacted parking maximum allowances in their place over a span of about 10 years and in 3 separate phases. I don't think this is a bad approach, although it does take a while. But in fairness, Longmont's parking policy is an approach that a lot of people are hesitant about because it kind of goes against the conventional wisdom. Personally, I think it was the right thing to do because minimum parking requirements come with a lot of negative outcomes. And I think those negative outcomes are way worse than someone having trouble finding a parking space. Next slide, please. So when a planner is charged with updating a section of city code, they frequently research what neighboring communities are doing, which was also true with parking code amendments. And where parking code amendments are concerned, they oftentimes consult the Institute of Transportation Engineers, or ITE's parking generation manual, which provides parking ratios for just about every use category you can think of. In years past, Longmont took this approach too. But for our latest amendments, we chose not to take this approach. Rather, we wanted the city's parking policy to match the city's larger planning goals and priorities. Next slide, please. So as I noted in the previous slide, Longmont decided to take a different approach than the orthodox one when updating our parking code. When Longmont got rid of its minimum parking requirement for commercial developments way back in 2014, we decided to take a market-based approach and generally let the developers dictate how much parking they need. But because we also didn't want to see overly large, underutilized parking lots, we went from minimum parking requirements to parking maximums. And I think you'll see why we did this in the next couple of slides. Some other concerns the city had was housing affordability, support for multimodalism, and compact transit-friendly development. Also, land devoted to parking represents an opportunity cost. So what else could that land be used for if not devoted to parking? So lastly, the cost of providing parking gets passed on to consumers and renters. Parking isn't cheap, and developers aren't charitable organizations. They do what they do to make a profit. And when you consider that a surface parking space can cost $5,000, according to some surveys, and that developments may have hundreds of spaces, how will developers recover that cost? So in a nutshell, those costs get passed on to consumers and renters in the form of higher prices for goods and services, lower wages, and certainly higher rents. Next slide, please. The BioLife development, which the yellow arrow points to, was parked at 6 spaces per 1,000 square feet of floor area. But the minimum parking requirement at the time this development was being reviewed was 4 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet of floor area. And so what do you think? Do they have enough parking? Well, they wanted even more than what you see here, which would have represented a variance. And so during the plan review for this project, reviewing staff had them add a note to the site plan stating that they'd have to provide photographic evidence that they needed the extra parking should they decide to seek a variance. Since this is pretty much what it looks like out there on a daily basis, they've obviously never come back to seek more parking. And this is just one example of many as to why Longmont put parking maximums in place. And you can see some other examples of overparked developments in the same photo, looking off to the left of BioLife. And next slide, please. So this is the Harvest Junction South Shopping Center in Longmont. It includes 4 major retailers. Got Lowe's, Michael's, Ross, Dress for Less, and Marshall's. And this retail development was parked at a ratio of 4 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet of floor area. And that was, again, a minimum parking requirement. And to be fair, this picture represents a snapshot in time. We don't know what day of the week it is or the time of day, but it does appear to be taken around noon, given how short the shadows are. I'd say by how green the trees are, it's probably spring or summer, maybe early fall. We do know that the parking demand is going to be different, depending upon the time of day, the day of the week, and the season. But we see this sort of thing repeated over and over and over again, which should give one pause, and it did for us. So on the positive side, it'll be easy to find a parking spot. Another positive is that once you do get rid of your minimum parking requirement, a development like this kind of becomes a land bank. So on the negative side, which is some of the things we were concerned about, a development like this leads to increased stormwater runoff. Another negative is that the cost of free parking is passed on to consumers or recoup their lower wages for workers or high prices for goods and services. A third negative is that large lots like this contribute to the urban heat island effect. And large parking lots also create greater distances between land uses, which encourages driving and discourages walking, biking, and transit use. So lastly, the land devoted to parking could be used for more productive purposes. I don't know, like housing humans as an example. Next slide, please. So my primary goal with this slide is to highlight the opportunity cost that comes along with a minimum parking requirement. And I randomly selected 8 site plans for multifamily developments in Longmont that were all constructed under the city's old minimum parking requirement. I then recorded the number of parking spaces provided for each development, the total number of units, the parking spaces provided, and the parking ratios. I also tallied the amount of land devoted to parking and drives in square feet and the percentage of land devoted to parking and drives compared to the total land of the development. What was eye-opening for me was that with just 8 multifamily developments, there was a total of 724,323 square feet of land, or 16.63 acres devoted for just parking and drives. And that's roughly the equivalent of about 17 football fields. So the nutshell question is this: what could you do with 17 football fields of land if you weren't devoting it to parking and drives? And for me, and I'd say for the city of Longmont, housing humans comes to mind. So if you're considering going with parking maximums, either with no accompanying minimum parking requirement or in conjunction with a minimum parking requirement, this is actually a good exercise to do because you'd be using your historical local data to right size your parking requirement. Pardon me, you'll notice under the parking to unit ratios, the most amount of parking provided on a per unit basis was 2.16 parking spaces per unit. The minimum parking requirement for all these developments was on a per bedroom basis. So as the number of bedrooms increased, so did the number of the minimum parking requirement. I personally believe that using local data is more reliable than using outside sources, which is one of the reasons why I did this exercise. And it will quickly reveal patterns, but it'll also reveal some of the outcomes to your parking policies. Next slide, please. So the table on the left shows what Longmont Parking Code used to look like prior to the city eliminating its minimum parking requirement. The table on the right shows what the code looks like today with the minimum parking requirement fully gone. As you can see, the current code is a lot simpler. Also referring back to the previous slide, you can see in the multifamily dwellings category how we used to require a minimum amount of parking. For efficiencies or one bedrooms, we required 1.5 spaces per dwelling. For 2-bedroom apartments, we required 1.75. And for 3-bedroom units, we required 2 spaces per dwelling. We realized through local studies that we didn't need to be this fine-grained with our parking policy. So when we went with parking maximums and we consolidated the amount allowed into a single number, which was a maximum of 2 spaces per unit. The next slide, please. So as I mentioned previously, we lined up the city's parking policy with some larger planning goals. One of the biggest concerns for the Longmont City Council was providing more affordable housing. I also mentioned that rather than using external sources to determine our parking policy, like ITE's parking generation manual or parking codes from other communities, we looked internally at our historic data to see what made sense. And hearkening back to ITE's parking generation, I think of would it make sense to apply a parking ratio used in San Francisco or New York to Los Angeles, just to use extreme examples? And I think the answer would be no. So in closing, it's been Longmont's contention that eliminating minimum parking requirements can help mitigate a number of negative issues. I mean, it won't eliminate them all, but it'll help. And some of the things we were concerned about included, first and foremost, housing affordability and over-reliance on single occupancy motor vehicle travel and associated greenhouse gases, excessive stormwater runoff, and the urban heat island, just to name a few. Next slide, please. So, oh, well, that's it. And so, thank you for, yeah, that's right. You can go one more. Thank you. That's it. Thanks for the opportunity to present on this subject. I look forward to taking questions a little later, or if you'd like to reach out to me directly, you can call or email me. My contact information is included here. And thank you so much for the opportunity to present. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben. That was useful information. Next, we have Libby Kaiser, who is a principal city planner with the City and County of Denver. There, she focuses on modernizing zoning regulations to implement city goals related to affordable and inclusive housing, multimodal transportation, and administrative clarity. Libby and her team recently completed a zoning code update to eliminate minimum vehicle parking requirements for all land uses citywide. Libby, take it away.
Great, thanks. You can forward to the next slide. So my presentation will focus on our reform of our parking regulations, as well as the strategies that our Department of Transportation utilizes to manage parking. You can jump forward. Awesome. So until recently, our zoning included really complicated parking requirements, where we had minimum requirements for almost all uses in most zone districts throughout the city. And those requirements varied by neighborhood context. And so they were, the parking ratio was higher in suburban areas and somewhat lower in urban areas. And then on top of that, we had pages and pages of the zoning code dedicated to alternatives, exemptions, and reductions to those parking requirements. So, for example, you could get like a reduction if you were providing affordable housing or were close to transit, or in the case of reusing a historic building. And so all of these different layers within our parking requirements made it really difficult for our customers to even figure out how much parking they really needed to provide. And so staff oftentimes had to do that calculation for them. And it was a big administrative burden that was taking staff hundreds of hours annually in order to compute what the actual parking requirement was. It is important to note that we didn't have a requirement for single unit houses or accessory dwelling units. But for multi-unit housing, typically one space was required per unit. And then our zoning regulations never required parking for downtown. And that's something that in some areas close into downtown, we have been chipping away at the parking requirements over the last few years, but for the most part, we still had citywide requirements. And next, please. And so while staff had been considering getting rid of parking requirements for several years, and we knew it was a best practice, we really didn't move forward with it until the state passed a law last year that required jurisdictions to stop enforcing parking requirements in applicable transit service areas, which were generally defined as areas within a quarter mile of a transit route with a minimum level of frequency. And when we put those applicable transit service areas over the city of Denver, it almost covered the entire city. And so we didn't want to just comply with state law and add more complexity to the zoning code, but instead decided that we were finally going to eliminate parking requirements citywide. Next. And so we proposed an amendment to our zoning code earlier this year, and we were going to remove minimum vehicle parking requirements for all land uses in all zone districts. And part of how we sold this was with these 3 points: that getting rid of parking requirements would promote the development of more housing. It would provide flexibility for developers to include the number of parking spaces necessary based on market conditions. And we hope moving forward, the developers will actually reduce the amount of parking they are providing, even though we knew that they often would provide much more parking than what was required by the zoning code, as Ben was highlighting up in Longmont as well. And then we also have been undergoing a broader effort to streamline our zoning regulations for efficiency and clarity, and to try to get projects approved much sooner than our pipeline has typically been taking. So I think these points did resonate with the public throughout this project. And then we also, in order to develop support for this text amendment, we partnered with 4 city council members, as well as our Department of Transportation and Infrastructure and our Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency. And we did a lot of outreach to advocacy organizations as well, like Denver Streets Partnership and SWEEP, which was a nonprofit instrumental in getting the state law passed. And so they also really helped get the word out and drum up support for this project, which ultimately, out of the few hundred comments that we got related to this project, we did have about 70% of public support. Next. And so within the code, the amended code, we removed vehicle parking exceptions, alternatives, and reductions, and that wiped out several pages of our zoning code, which was really satisfying. And then we also took parking out of our use tables and consolidated bike parking requirements, which we kept, into one article and put them in tables of their own. And then we also maintained some existing maximum parking requirements that we had, where you couldn't provide more than 110% of the minimum parking requirement within a quarter mile of transit stations. And one of our downtown districts also has maximum parking, but we didn't extend any maximum parking limitations to other areas. Next. So this is a map from the Parking Reform Network that has been tracking parking reform around the world. And in the US, we're up to about 97 jurisdictions that have gotten rid of parking requirements. So we certainly weren't at the forefront of this. Longmont was the only jurisdiction in Colorado that had done this before. But it is exciting to highlight that Denver did become one of only 7 jurisdictions with a population over 500,000 to get rid of parking requirements. Next. And so then I'll talk a bit about some parking management strategies that the Department of Transportation employs to help manage parking demand within the right-of-way. Next. And Dottie was really a key partner with us, as several of our plans and programs, including those put out by Dottie, really prioritize walking and rolling over driving in the city. And so Dottie has a few different plans and programs that help to kind of manage parking demand. Next. And one of those tools is our Transportation Demand Management Program, which has only been in the works for the last few years. So we don't have a ton of data yet on how well it's working. But there are 3 different tiers where, depending on the size of the development based on square footage, the developer has to propose some methods for reducing the transportation demand that that project will generate. So those tools could include providing bicycle parking, providing bus passes, things of that nature that give residents or employees an option to get to their destinations without driving. Next. And then one of our really popular programs are our curbside area management plans. And these are focused on a particular neighborhood that has a high demand for on-street parking, where folks are basically like fighting each other over parking in front of their homes. And in the development of these plans, it does require community engagement, and the tools used to manage that curbside parking can include time parking restrictions, as well as maybe paid parking that's required, and residential parking permit zones. And there are several areas that do have these curbside plans today, and there's demand for a lot more of them. So while we know that it helps, there's certainly a desire from the community for us to roll these out faster. Next. And then the residential parking permit program can be a part of our curbside management plans that can improve resident parking access to their residents so they don't have to park a couple blocks away. And then it can also be tied to a specific license plate, or you could have like a parking permit hanging in your car. So those are some of the ways that Dottie really gets involved in managing parking in the right of way, and that helps kind of alleviate some concerns that getting rid of off-street parking would create a ton of problems throughout the city. So that concludes my presentation. And we'll take questions at the end.
Great, thank you, Libby. Next is Mark Ambrosi, the Principal Transportation Planner for the City and County of Broomfield, where he is dedicated to shaping the community's multimodal future, along with the full spectrum of transportation planning activities. Mark has honed his planning expertise across various scales of government, from a metropolitan planning organization in New Hampshire to long-range transportation planning for Boulder County. Mark brings an implementation-focused perspective to this exchange. Mark?
All right, thank you, Noreen. So good afternoon. My name is Mark Ambrosi, again, Principal Transportation Planner at Broomfield. And yeah, getting into Broomfield's approach to our recent parking policy updates. So just To start quickly with a little bit of background for those who may not be as familiar with Broomfield, we're located about halfway between Denver and Boulder. We're a very suburban community with about 75,000 residents. We expect that to expand to over 100,000 in the coming years. Prior to 2023, Broomfield had not conducted a major update to our parking code for over 20 years, so it was a long time coming. Since 2023, we've done it twice. First time in 2023 to kind of do a major overhaul, and then again in 2025 to address some state legislation. Our first code update was part of a larger municipal effort to modernize all areas of our municipal code. And so issues with the old code, prior to 2023, we had no parking maximums. We were overparked for almost every land use that we had in our tables. We had land use types that didn't match the types of development that we were seeing in Broomfield at that time. And we didn't have any bike parking requirements. So those are things we wanted to change. Our initial goals were to, number one, modernize our parking requirements to reduce variance requests that we were receiving quite a few of. A lot of developers were asking to have fewer parking spaces than our parking minimums allowed. We wanted to update the land use types. We added electric vehicle charging station requirements. We added bicycle parking requirements. In the 2025 update, we also ensured our parking requirements conformed with the state legislation, which essentially just meant expanding on the updates we did in 2023. Next slide, please. So in the 2023 code update, we reduced parking requirements for most land use types. We established parking reduction areas, which are essentially overlay areas that you can see in the graphic on the right side of the screen. What those did was further reduce parking requirements in those areas. Those are areas around existing or planned transit, and they were higher density than some of the other areas in Broomfield. We also established parking maximum community-wide. We added those EV parking requirements and added bicycle parking. And again, in 2025, we basically expanded those requirements that we had established in 2023 to align with the state legislation. Next slide, please. So there are a number of factors that kind of informed our decisions as we were pursuing new parking policy in Broomfield. In the development of the code, we reviewed regional norms. We looked at land use types and their associated parking requirements for a handful of municipalities and jurisdictions in the Denver metro area, noting when those were last updated, as some of the older ones had higher parking requirements. We also spent some time reviewing the ITE parking generation manual. And what we were looking for in there was not what communities were allowing for their parking policies, but what the average occupancy rates actually were for certain land uses. In addition to that, we reviewed studies, reports, scholarly articles about best parking practices. We conducted outreach with the public, with businesses, developers, and our emergency response folks. And we ensured the proposed code aligned with parking policies from our policies from our comprehensive plan. Next slide, please. Some of the other factors that influenced our parking policy. The first one is the land use development patterns. Broomfield's a very suburban community. We have regional commercial, we have a bunch of clusters of housing, and pretty auto-centric at this point. In recent years, we've identified certain locations within the community that we're trying to develop nodes of density and promote more development and direct it to those areas throughout the community. But it was really important for us to acknowledge that our historic development patterns created a really auto-centric environment. To get groceries, you had to drive a couple of miles to get there. It wasn't set up around transit. It wasn't set up around density. So we wanted to be sensitive to that reality that we existed in. Our employment trends were another really important factor. that impacted our choices for the parking policy. And we really have two key realities that were important for Broomfield, and that's most of our residents work outside of the community, so they're having to get to their place of employment, and oftentimes it's not super close by. Similarly, most of the employees that work in Broomfield are coming from outside of Broomfield, so there's commutes daily into Broomfield, and we need space for them, whether it's their bikes, their vehicles, or ways for them to access their places of employment. We also have some transportation realities that are kind of important. Broomfield doesn't have great transit service at this time. We have transit on some of our major corridors, so US 36, we have the Flatiron Flyer. 120th has some transit. We have Flex Ride throughout the community, but yeah, there's not a ton of fixed route transit, so it is somewhat difficult to get around the community due to the transportation choices that we have available. With that said, we have invested a lot of resources into developing our active modes infrastructure, and so that's one way to get around, but it definitely needs more work over time. Next slide, please. I also want to talk a little bit about the engagement that we conducted in developing this plan. It's important to Broomfield to hear from the public and developers and to keep close communication with our community to understand what their needs are. So for our engagement approach, it was multi-pronged. We have digital engagement through the Broomfield Voice platform, which allows residents and members of the public at large to provide feedback about anything that we're doing in the community. We also got messages out to the public through various channels, some of the Broomfield newsletters, social media, and other ways, just to make sure that people understood that this was coming down the pipe and they had the opportunity to let us know what they thought. And then we also specifically contacted all the frequent flyer developers in Broomfield to engage with them and just let them know that this was happening. We also offered opportunities for them to have face-to-face meetings, and we hosted a couple of developer meetings where we were seeking feedback. Next slide, please. So regarding the successes and challenges that Broomfield had, I think one thing that I'm quite happy about that I think has worked out pretty well for our community was the targeted parking reduction areas approach that we used. I think this helped us alleviate some of the political concerns that some of our city council members had. It also helped communicate with the public why we were taking or reducing parking requirements further in certain areas that did have some different transportation opportunities for them. We also have been able to reduce variance requests, which is a big reason that we started this in the first place. That was taking up a lot of time during our city council meetings. And so it's been helpful with the new code. We've seen less parking with new development in Broomfield, just generally. Although I will mention we still have some pushback in certain areas and from certain developers. The revised code has helped staff. It's more simple. We have something that we can point to now when we're working with developers to review their proposals, and that's been really helpful for us. And then really the bicycle parking has been pretty seamless. We haven't had almost any pushback at all from developers. The community likes it, developers like it, and we have long and short-term bicycle parking requirements. So I think that's been a pretty big success for us. We've also had a few challenges. I'd say the biggest challenge that we've heard comes from the development community, and it's about project financing. What we are hearing from some of our developers is that they have stipulations from lenders and or kind of their future tenants that they have agreements with about what the minimum parking requirements need to be. Frequently, those exceed what we allow as our maximums in the areas that these developments are taking place. And so we've worked with the developers in these situations, but it is something that it's not just you reduce parking and everybody complies and nobody has parking anymore. There is some negotiation that we found is necessary. We've also noticed that if we want to realize like the parking reductions in Broomfield, it's really important that we have complementary land uses. And so we can't just have dense residential without any grocery stores or services around them. we really need that mix of different land use types to support creating neighborhoods where people can have all of their needs met. And when we don't have that, and we don't have that in certain areas of the community, it's more difficult to eliminate parking, and there's more pushback against that for us. And then, as mentioned before, the limited transit in Broomfield is another area of difficulty. Having transportation options is really helpful when you want people to make a choice that's not in their personal automobile, or you don't want people to rely on that entirely. And so transit is a limiting factor for us. We have just developed a transit plan to identify areas where we could expand that in the future. But at this time, we're, you know, somewhat transit poor, except on these regional corridors. And so we're trying to be targeted with where we really are focusing on reducing parking. Next slide, please. So some of the future predictions that we have for this policy and where we see this going, I think that as we continue to develop as a community over time, we're going to create those nodes of density with multiple land use types that really support kind of a more neighborhood feel and reduce reliance on personal automobiles. And I think that's a big thing. We again are focusing a lot of the development into certain areas of the community, and seeing a lot of redevelopment. And so we're hopeful about that. And that's great. We also have a couple of emerging regional transit routes in Broomfield. There's transit that is scheduled to be started on I-25 in the coming years, and on Colorado 7. And I think that's going to help an awful lot with the people living in those areas, and developers to make different choices around parking because different options will be available. We have ongoing improvements in our active modes infrastructure in the community. That includes adding wayfinding so people can actually get where they need to go or know where they need to go. And that certainly helps people with providing more transportation options. One thing that's kind of going in the other direction, our trends for our employment continue or have continued over the past about 10 years to become more exaggerated. And so we have more people living in Broomfield working outside of Broomfield than we did 10 years ago, and vice versa. And so that's a pressure kind of going in the other direction. And so unless we have better transit service and last mile connections, first and final mile connections, that's going to continue to be a pressure for having parking spaces at a lot of locations. And so I guess, and to sum it up, Broomfield's parking policy, we really want to react to the conditions in our community and the trends that we're seeing around us. And we want to be progressive. The environmental stuff is really important to us, being good stewards of the land, using the land for its highest and best use is important to us, but we also need to tailor our policy, and we're going to continue to do that to meet the realities in our community and the needs of our residents. So that's what I've got. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Our last panelist is Chris Hagelin, a principal project manager planner with the City of Boulder, where he primarily manages the TDM and metrics programs. He is responsible for working with employers, employees, and residents to reduce single occupant vehicle travel, vehicle miles of travel, and transportation-related emissions. In addition to these programs, Chris was a part of the team that worked on parking policy changes that led to the development of a TDM plan for new development to complement the elimination of parking minimums. I will turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Noreen. Glad to join in with this idea exchange and very happy to share the Boulder experience. Boulder, just this summer, in relationship to the parking policy changes at the state, basically looked at our AMPS program, which is our Access Management and Parking Strategies program. And we brought to council over the course of the summer 3 different ordinance changes related to that. So we have our on-street parking changes. We have off-street parking changes that were most directly related to the House bill that stimulated all of this. And then also the TDM component. And these all work together. We knew that once we looked at eliminating parking minimums in the city of Boulder, we were going to have to control both the spillover onto on-street, which is possible when you reduce the number of parking spaces at new developments, and then also what are the TDM requirements for that new development. So, if you think about the parking supply going down, what is the TDM that you have to do to make sure that amount of parking works and doesn't negatively affect adjacent properties or surrounding neighborhoods? And so that's where the on-street work comes in as well. So they were all kind of put together under our AMPS umbrella. Next slide, please. So in terms of the off-street parking, what the city of Boulder decided to do was to eliminate the minimum parking requirements citywide for all land uses, not just the residential. We just said, let's just do it for both res and non-res. And then as the case with, I think, the city and county of Denver, most of the area fell under the transit service area. So we said, why don't we just do this citywide? So we just eliminated all those minimum parking requirements. We also chose not to add any maximum parking requirements. I think for the main reason that in the city of Boulder, virtually all of our large projects that are coming through site review, almost all of them were asking for a parking reduction when we had those minimum parking requirements. And we knew from years of data collection, we did 3 different rounds over many years, data collection, that we were just way overparked for the most part, especially with some of our large retail, our office, and things like that. So we were all on board just to eliminate both minimums and maximums. We also took the opportunity to look at bicycle parking and the design standards, not necessarily the amount of bicycle parking, but the design standards, just because of the different types of bikes that we're seeing in Boulder, larger bikes, cargo bikes, larger electric vehicles. So we wanted to look at that. We also wanted to look at shared parking and to understand what are some of the assumptions that we can use when we have a new development that is proposing sharing parking between daytime and nighttime uses? What are those logical assumptions that we can make? And then finally, we initially started looking at EV charging requirements, but we decided we really didn't need to change the standards that we currently have. Next slide, please. In terms of on-street, a lot of this was really related to our neighborhood parking permit program. So in many of our commercial areas where we have managed parking or paid parking, we do want to prevent the spillover just a couple blocks over into neighborhoods. It really becomes a livability issue. And so we did want to look at our neighborhood parking permit programs and evaluate some of our policies, make some tweaks to them. And we also took it as an opportunity to promote some new things about promoting more active transportation within areas such as our park and walk to school area so we can reduce congestion around neighborhood schools. We also, with our neighborhood parking permit program, had both guest and visitor permits, but we saw that a lot of those we were kind of handing those out too generously, and maybe a lot of them weren't being used. So we did place some stricter limits on how many guest and visitor permits residents could have as part of the NPP, including restricting the number of permits per licensed driver. One of the more innovative things we're looking at is introducing a TDM wallet idea. So this is really about if there is a neighborhood parking permit program, residents are paying for permits that be able to park on their street, and maybe we're selling some commuter permits to fill in some of those gaps. Can we use the revenue from those programs to provide a benefit to the community? So right now we're looking at a pilot program in the Goss Grove neighborhood next to downtown, where in exchange for having this managed parking situation, having to pay to park, on your streets with permits, but then also with some commuter permit money, we can buy eco passes, RTD eco passes for folks in the neighborhood. So a little give and take there. We also wanted to think about how we better regulate mixed use areas around these neighborhood parking permit areas. Next slide, please. In general, we did look at possibly limiting the new NPP programs. We really want to have these where they're warranted and absolutely needed, where you have residential communities right next to our kind of traffic generating commercial areas, and not just, a lot of people were petitioning for these things for reasons outside of that. And then we also had to think about when we had a new development come in, and it was a significant development, and possibly they're providing less on-site parking, what are the conditions that need to occur to trigger a study to see if we need to do something like a neighborhood parking permit to control any of that spillover? So we looked at creating some triggers for that as well, because that's one thing you see in Boulder when you have a large commercial development next to a residential area. That's where you get a lot of pushback from the residents not wanting to see any development. But if we can ensure them that there's not going to be spillover through the development of a neighborhood parking permit program or other tools or policies, then that helps get folks on board with some of these development projects. Next slide, please. But what I wanted to spend a little bit more time on, since we've covered a lot of the parking ideas, is Boulder's new TDM ordinance for new development. So, and this was the thing that I most worked on, and right now we're in the process of implementing it so that it is ready for projects that come in after April 1st of next year. So the purpose of our TDM ordinance is, as I said in the beginning, it's really to make sure that we balance this new environment of less on-street or less on-site parking with more TDM to make sure that they work and they're not affecting those other areas. So we want to use this TDM ordinance to mitigate the impacts of new development on our transportation system, on adjacent properties and surrounding neighborhoods. We want to use this opportunity when we have new development to enhance access and use of our investments in multimodal projects and TDM programs and services. As I said, we want to complement the elimination of those minimum parking requirements. And we want to create an ordinance that actually means something and that actually does something over time so that it really does contribute to our transportation and climate goals of reducing single occupant vehicle trips and emissions. And I'll explain kind of how we integrated that purpose into our design. Next slide, please. So when we were designing the TDM ordinance to complement these parking policy changes, we wanted to think about the application of the ordinance. To which developments would this ordinance apply? Would it be to all of them, or would we have some restrictions based on size, impact, or type? We wanted to understand what would we require in terms of TDM programs. Would we be fairly agnostic and say, hey, we don't care what you do as long as it works and as long as it mitigates the impacts? Or would we have more of a prescriptive approach where we say, we want you to do X, Y, and Z, buy eco passes, buy B-cycle memberships, and those types of things. So very prescriptive approach. So we had to think about that policy dial and where do you want to turn it? We also know that these TDM programs have costs. And typically, our most successful TDM programs, the ones that we think most change travel behavior, they have annual costs. Eco passes is probably our number one tool in changing travel behavior, and it has an annual cost. So what is the requirement going to be to pay for these ongoing costs, and who's going to do it? Basically, you have the developers or the owners of the properties that are developing, mostly in Boulder, it's redevelopment, or the tenants who actually then are leasing that space in those buildings. So who's going to pay for those ongoing TDM programs? And then how much are they going to pay? Are they going to pay a fully loaded cost of not only the EcoPass, but the administration of those programs? So is it going to be the fully loaded costs? Are they going to just pay the actual cost of like a B cycle membership cost X, and that's what you're going to pay? Or is it going to just be subsidized? We're just going to have developers or owners contribute a portion to it. So all these things we needed to figure out. We also had to understand what was the measurement of success. How do we know that this TDM ordinance is going to be effective in reducing vehicle trips? And how are we going to measure that and know that a property is in compliance? And then we had to think about all the ongoing monitoring that is going to be needed to make sure that this program works and it's effective, and we know it is. And if we need to change things, we can use this kind of ongoing process of evaluation to make changes to it to kind of dial that in over time. Next slide, please. So the next few slides are going to kind of show you where we fell on those policy dials of how you turned them. So we ended up going with a tiered approach. This is basically an ordinance that would apply to all projects that meet the thresholds of new floor area. So we're only looking at new floor area. We're not looking at just a remodel. This is new additions or a new total rebuild. And that there are going to be certain thresholds that will trigger the ordinance. Small projects would be exempt. Medium-sized projects would have some requirements, and then the largest tier 2 projects would have the most requirements. We really wanted to have that tiered approach to make sure we focus on the most impactful projects. We manage staff time and cost. We also have some zoning that already has TDM requirements in our place like Boulder Junction and in our transit-oriented development area, so we exempted those and the smallest projects. Next slide, please. In terms of the TDM packages of programs and services, we basically took a package approach where we offered 3 different packages that a developer could choose from or a tenant could choose from once the tenants are in the buildings. And staff can help with them to decide which package is the most effective. And so we have our EcoPass Plus package, which is you will provide the EcoPass to all residents of a residential building or all employees of a commercial building. And then you also provide benefits related to car share, van pooling, bike share, participate in way to go programs, and that you would appoint someone to be kind of that main point of contact or that employee transportation coordinator. We had to make some assumptions on pickup rates of how many people would take advantage of van pool subsidies, how many people would take advantage of a bike share membership for free. Eco passes are easy. You have to buy them for everybody to get the highly discounted product. So we also had a second package that was really the more flexible, kind of your parking cash out, or kind of the new phrase, your transportation wallet idea, where you would really have that flexibility of how you would spend the money for these TDM programs. And then, if a developer came up to us with a great crazy innovative idea, we could say, all right, let's try it. So that would be under package 3, our custom approach. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned, the thing that we know about TDM is that 1, the most effective programs have annual costs, and 2, they are implemented by tenants. They're not implemented by the property owner, the developer. Sometimes, it's one company that owns the property and has the employees there. But oftentimes, these are multi-tenant buildings, and so what we ended up deciding is that the owner or the developer of that property is going to pay an annual financial guarantee That annual financial guarantee is held by the city, so we make sure that it's paid, and then we're going to disperse it to the tenants of that building. And so if you have a building with three different employers leasing the space there, that money would be dispersed based on square footage, and it would go to those tenants to implement and pay for the programs for the TDM plan. So we looked at annual financial guarantee levels for both Tier 1 and Tier 2 projects. They would be paid annually by the developer or the owner of the property, held by the city, dispersed to the tenants, and that money is used to pay for the TDM programs, buying eco passes, providing bike share memberships, subsidizing van pools, car share, you name it. And then for our largest ones, we'd also have a remedial financial guarantee. This is a one-time pot of money that sits there, and if the development is not meeting its goals, we can use that pot of money to augment those annual financial guarantees, have a little bit more money to spend, offer some more different programs so that we could help maybe meet those goals. The rates are all based on square footage or number of units. Next slide, please. Now, the slide everybody wants to see, here's what we came up with the costs. So basically for our commercial uses, a Tier 1 property, we looked at the different TDM programs, the cost of them, these assumptions about pickup rates or use of an offered benefit. And we came up with basically at Tier 1, we're looking at spending about $200 per employee per year. At the Tier 2, the larger ones where we really want to see an impact and a reduction of vehicle trips, about $350 per year per employee. We kind of translated that into square footage based on land use and the number of square footage per employee. And so we came up with these different rates for office, retail, light industrial, just to show a few of the categories. On residential, if you're under 40 units, you don't have to do anything. If you're 40 to 99, you're essentially going to be paying $180 per dwelling unit, and that will be used to buy eco passes and other benefits for those residents. If you're over 100 units, then you're going to be paying $280 per year per unit, and those all dedicated to providing these ongoing annual TDM programs to those residents. Next slide, please. We also want to have a monitoring process, but we're only really concerned about the Tier 2, the larger ones. Tier 1, they have to put up their money, they have to buy the TDM programs and services, they have to show that they've done that, but they're not really monitored. The Tier 2, the larger ones, we're going to have a trip generation target, really based on hitting 30% below ITE rates. They'll have to do an annual trip generation study and report, submitting that to the city. If they're in compliance 3 years in a row, they're at or below their target, great. Monitoring shifts to every 5 years. We'll take a check on them. But if they're out of compliance, that's when they use that remedial financial guarantee that's used to augment those annual funds, kick in a little bit more money so they can provide some additional incentives, maybe up their parking cash out, and those types of things. And then a new 3-year cycle starts. Next slide, please. Oh. And I guess that's it. So thank you for the time to talk a little bit about Boulder's experience with parking and TDM.
Thank you, Chris. Next, we have a question and answer period for all panelists to address audience questions. Question number 1, and I'll address this to Ben. How does on-street parking factor into the considerations you shared?
Sure. Well, prior to eliminating the minimum parking requirement, we used to allow developers to apply the adjacent on-street parking towards the minimum parking requirements. But since